I'll just request Jaswinder ma'am to please mute your mic. Thank you. Sir, am I audible to you, sir?
Yes, yes, please. Yeah.
Sir, a very good afternoon to all the present. So we have amongst us the expert convener for today's session on why China's past shapes the COVID world and how India-China relations were shaped in 1960s. So we are honored to have Mr. Probal DasGupta, who is the author of Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China. A brief about Sir. He is a former army officer. He was commissioned into 11 Gurkha Rifles Regiment of the Indian Army, where he spent the initial decade of his career. He served in the Kashmir Valley, Bhutan, and Northeast India, and served in areas operating against terrorism and militancy. So after taking the premature retirement from the army, Sir attained the master's degree from Columbia University in New York, where he was a Braun Myers Fellow and Tata Scholar. His writings on South Asia, conflicts, and strategic risks have appeared in the Yale Journal of International Affairs, Mint, Nikkei Asian Review, Economic Times, Deccan Herald, Asian Age, Bloomberg, and the Times of India. Alongside his career as an author and historian, Probal Sir is a business leader who advises global firms on strategic investment, business and political risk in South Asia and other countries. He has been a regular speaker on strategy and leadership at various forums such as Gateway House, CII, IVCA, and other eminent corporate firms. He is also a guest lecturer at Columbia University, where he conducts sessions on global economy and the role of asymmetric stakeholders. An avid amateur, distance runner, and global traveler with several professional career interests, he has lived in India and US. So we are really honored to have you amongst us. And we thank you for sparing out the time and addressing the webinar to the Gen X and to the various faculties present over here. Over to you, sir, please.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for the generous introduction. I really appreciate it, and I am honored and privileged to be here speaking with all of you. It's a weekend, so I am very appreciative of the fact that you've taken out your time to be here and discussing this subject. That's something which is very, very I'm really delighted to hear that, and I hope we are able to have an interesting session. I can promise you a chunk of history. That's something that kind of is very relevant to the current ongoings and current circumstances that you see around the world on account of COVID. The format that I would, this is something that we would do, is let me talk through the subject for a while, and then I will leave it open to the questions that will follow at the end. So please feel free to ask questions. There are no questions that are, inadequate or not good enough. All questions are interesting, and I love to have questions that challenge. So that being the start point. The subject of today is actually the subject that we are reading about around us in newspapers. We are talking about COVID, we are talking about China, we're talking about China and we're talking about Ladakh, we're talking about China, we're talking about Hong Kong, we're talking about China, we're talking about Taiwan, we're talking about China, we're talking about the US. So I think China has got multi-pronged connects across the world, across various subjects, whether it is Ladakh, whether it is Sikkim, whether it is Nepal, you can just name it. And I'm not sure how many hits China would produce if you were to just Google China today. And the relevance of the country is even more paramount, given that China is India's immediate neighbor, and a neighbor that does not have a very friendly history of relationship with India. And that makes it even more pertinent that we understand, what does China want? Now, that's a question that I will also, tomorrow's Times of India, I'm writing an editorial on this subject as to what does China want. Um, this is something that defines where we are with the virus, whether you call it the Wuhan virus or whether you call it the COVID-19 virus. That's a subjective matter, but it does have China's relevant role in it. It is, if you look at it only as a virus that has escaped from a lab or a virus that has come from a bat, whichever way you'd like to believe it, that is just the tactical part of it. The more important issue here is, why do viruses come from China all the time? It's not about the fact that, well, Chinese people essentially have a diet that includes a lot of other things that we don't eat, and perhaps it comes from there. But then again, that is talking about one part of it. 2003, many of you would remember, SARS virus had come from China, had affected the world, not in so much degree that this one has, but it also caused a lot of worry. Thereafter, there was another one. So there have been 3 or 4 viruses in the last few decades that have come from China. So when we look at the current pandemic, and just so we stay on course with the subject of the day, what does it mean in terms of China's role in it? And we go back in history. We go back in history to understand, where did all this come about? And it's not today. It's not about yesterday. It actually started many centuries ago. The reason why I say that is the context of the virus, the context of where China is today, is to be kept in mind when we look at, or when we examine the intent of China with respect to the world many years ago. In the earlier part in ancient history, China used to be considered as the center of the world by their own citizens. It used to be called the heaven under the skies. What does that mean? You used to call it Tianxia. Tianxia was a concept that Chinese used. Heavens under the skies means that the rest of the world is around the kingdom of heaven, which is China. And the Chinese emperor, thus, is the son of God. This is what they meant. This is what they believed in. This is how they also define their borders. And this is an important thought to be kept in mind, because this is where the Chinese thinking, or the Chinese philosophy of them and the world comes from, Tianxia. Now, when we keep this in mind, a lot of things will fall in place. A lot of things like border disputes, many things such as China's ascension, to the global stage, the ambitions, the rivalry with the US, the rivalry with India, all of this will fall in place. And how? Let's talk about it. So when I say Tianxia, China's ambition to be, China's belief that it was the center of the earth, China believed at that point of time that the others should pay them protection money, like we call it hafta in today's lingo. Hafta is the gunda who asks for people to pay him protection money to protect them, and that's by force, right? So in that time, Vietnam and some of these countries, they would pay China protection money to protect them, and there was not an option. It was by force. So when once the Vietnamese king decided to play the other way, said, well, I'm a king in my own right, why should I pay China the money? The Chinese emperor sent a message for the Vietnamese king to be called to China. But the Chinese emperor didn't meet him. He was met by the 4th grade people, the third grade, 4th grade, in the order of hierarchy. And he was shown around China, and he was made to be present in the emperor's court in China, in Peking, and he was made to sit behind and so he was humiliated in a manner which kind of sent a message that, look, we are much bigger. You were just a little vassal, a pawn. and we can just bring you in and make you sit somewhere else and send you back. So when he was, and the various other incidents that happened. So when he was sent back, the message was very clear that if you don't comply, see the kind of massive strength that we have. And this is something that China even maintains even today. It shows off its strength. You'll see that in every feature, in every stage of the global, you know, in every stage in the global arena, that you will see that China tries to impose itself. The first step is the step of aggression, is the step of show of strength, is a step of superiority, is a step of racism. That is what comes out in every step that China takes in its foreign policy measures. Now, when we take that part of history forward, and we take it to a time in the 1900s, what happened in the 1900s? It was a period of humiliation for China. They lost to the Japanese many times. The Japanese came and invaded, and for those of you familiar with history, they would know how the Japanese. There's a controversy about how the Japanese treated the Chinese prisoners, especially women, and that happened in a series of incidents. Then came, China's defeat, and 1903 was a time when 8 countries lay siege to Beijing and captured that land. The Indian soldiers also went there as well as part of the British Army. So Indian soldiers actually paraded through the main square in then Peking, now Beijing, in 1903 as part of the British forces. So there was an 8-country alliance that had come about and had pushed China. So, and the Japanese forces had defeated them as well. So until the communists took over, Mao Zedong took over, the Chinese had suffered a century of humiliation, but they believed that they had been undone, that their rightful place was at the center of the earth, and that had been taken away. So that is the genesis of everything that comes now. It's that thought, it's that belief, it's that compelling thought inside oneself that, look, I was supposed to be at the center of the earth, but I have been pushed aside and marginalized, and the world doesn't even count me as one of their important citizens. When the Second World War was fought, China was fighting its internal war. The communists were taking on Chiang Kai-shek, and subsequently the communists took over the mainland, and Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan. And we all know how Taiwan and China have bitter relations today. And that is the genesis, because once the other party, which was fighting the main Chinese Communist Party, was defeated, they went and took refuge in Taiwan and set themselves up there. When the World War ended, you had newer constituents. What happened? What happened when the World War ended? You had the US, which had come out as a victor, along with the Allies and the Soviets. So they decided that, look, we shouldn't have this kind of a conflict and war again. So we should set up bodies such as United Nations, such as several other global multilateral organizations to take care of exchanges at the global level. So they set those up, right? Who was left out of it? China, because they were fighting their internal battles. Their internal systems were still being, churned to come out with a coherent state as a country, and which they did in 1949. And that was after the World War, when Mao Zedong and his party established themselves as the head of the government, and China began to exist as a state, as a communist state thereafter, but as a belligerent communist state. And why would I say that? In 1953, and I won't go into the details, China within years had been involved in the Korean War. Before that, China had invaded Tibet. So when you look at China, it is the only state that has continually wanted to expand after, in the 1900s, in the 2000s. And if you leave aside Israel and Palestine, the issues there, China is one state that has continually had, and that has had the most number of issues with its neighbors, with others in the neighborhood, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's Indian Ocean, whether it is the Himalayas. So China has had those issues, invading Tibet, sitting there, looking at Sikkim. So these things had China's stamp of belligerence and ambition marked all over it. It was very evident how China was wanting to progress forward into the new century by expanding, expansionist. And then you had, and we'll come to the book, but what happened was China was bottled up because it was not allowed at the global stage. It was trying to expand, but Soviets and the Americans were far too big. They were having the Cold War. What changed? Where was this change? Badlav kahan aaya? What change? Where did that happen? When did that happen? That happened in the 80s. 80s May, if you remember, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And the Soviets collapsed as a government. Once the Soviets collapsed, who came in? The Chinese. In 1990s, the Chinese were brought in by whom? By the Americans into the global stage. They were thinkers like Joseph Nye and others who believed that, look, China will be brought into the global stage, and over a period of time, like the Soviets who collapsed, Chinese will either adhere to democracy or will collapse. That was a thought, and that was a thought that was coming on the back of what the Americans had seen with the Soviets in the 80s, that the system had dismantled from within, that the system had imploded from within. So they said, here's a learning. We'll not allow the Chinese to implode. We'll not allow communism to grow, because China is not that big that then, and we will let them come into the system of democracy, because they believe that, look, democracy is really spreading its wings. Now, the only communist big power, supposedly so if you leave out Cuba, was China. So what happened? China was brought into the global system. It became part of the multilateral system and, global trade, etc. China started to grow. In 1999, two Chinese scholars wrote a book, Unrestricted Warfare. Now, what did that mean? Unrestricted Warfare was a book that documents how a smaller power, a lesser power, can actually outwit a larger power, larger military power, larger economic power, through various means, through creative means that could be deployed to do so. Which were the two powers they were talking about? They were talking about China, of course, a smaller power, a lesser power with great ambitions. And how would China overpower a greater global power like the US? By using various means. And those means were outlined in the book. I wouldn't want to go into them, but those are the means which they spoke about, which they wrote about in 1999, is what we see today, which is China moving the multilateral organizations, China manipulating the multilateral organizations, China going into those political systems that are not very strong, democracies that are not very strong. Which are those democracies? Those are the democracies that would have dictators. Those are the democracies that turn around very quickly. I'll come to that. Nepal is one. Maldives is another. Sri Lanka was, I can keep giving you examples. So those were 3, 4, 5 prongs that they wrote about. They said, this is what China should do to take on a classical economic power, a classical military power that is much bigger than them. And that has its basis on Sun Tzu's military warfare. How do you take on a bigger enemy? It all goes back to a civilizational aspect. And that's why when I was talking to Mr. Atipriya, I said, look, we must talk about the genesis. We must talk about the journey as to where it all began. And then it starts to unfurl, unravel. It makes sense where we are. Otherwise, we're looking at a tactical thing. Oh, 3,000 affected, 40,000. What does this mean? Where does this come from? Virus has gone here, virus has gone there. This is something that we're facing today. But this has a larger context. This has a deeper context. A journey that started earlier. We talk about 2003, the SARS outbreak after 1999. The SARS outbreak happened, but who was in charge in China? This was something that was documented in the book, that this is how China could overpower a greater military power such as the United States. But in 2003, Hu Jintao was the Chinese premier. When Hu Jintao was the premier, China had not become the force that it is today. It had not started to manipulate the multilateral institutions. Therefore, in 2003, when the SARS outbreak took place, WHO, and mark this, WHO was quick to spot it and tell the world that, look, this is an outbreak that's going to be dangerous. So stop all your incoming roads from China and into China. So that is a warning that WHO, which is supposed to give, did so in 2003. And that's a marked departure from what we see today. So 2003, and we link it to the political power. You link it to where China was economically, politically. So Hu Jintao was still consolidating. That was a consolidation phase of China. So Hu Jintao was still trying to figure out where China would be, where China would go. And that's why, though the SARS outbreak had taken place, it was controlled, it was managed by a multilateral organization that sounded the warning in time to the rest of the world. What happened thereafter? There was a global financial crisis. A lot of economies got affected. China began to benefit from there, and there onwards. China lasted as an economy, did fairly all right. And 2013-14, when Xi Jinping came on, there was a marked change in China's behavior. There was a marked change in how China would want to assert itself on the rest of the world. And what did it do? It talked a very aggressive language right from that time. What did we see in the 2015, 16, 17s? We saw China trying to manipulate multilateral institutions. We saw China take on the disputes in South China Sea against Vietnam, against Philippines. Where does it go back to? Tianxia, where people paid them their hafta, their protection money. So now they said, well, these seas, these waters belong to us. They started putting artificial lands there. It's called the 9-dash line. And they started taking on Philippines. They started investing money and time on dictators. Hambantota port was a strategic port which they wanted to take on. They started investing money in Nepal. They started doing that across the African countries. They wanted to wield power by influence now. They believed they had come onto the world stage. Now, 25 years after the Soviets had collapsed, and this was a time that they knew that they could impose themselves on America, that was largely being restricted to what they would conventionally do. For China, this was the time for unrestricted warfare of 1999. This was the time to upstage the existing global power. What do? If you look at the South China Sea dispute, for those who have followed that particular area of dispute, there was a ruling given by the International Court of Justice against China in terms of China's dispute with the Philippines. China set that aside. Then the WHO was coming. I mean, there was the appointment of the new WHO chief was coming up. So in that sense, in that case, what did China do? China made sure that Tedros Ghebreyesus, who was one of the contenders from Africa, one of the nominees, was given the job. China pushed for it because they knew that Tedros would be their man. What they had started doing is that, look, I mean, if you have the multilateral institutions go on as they are, they will be giving rulings against us. So what do? We go inside. We change the man. And that's what they had started to do at the global stage. Ghebreyesus was the one of the favorite people of Robert Mugabe was a Zimbabwe president, and Robert Mugabe was again a Chinese beneficiary. And this is all entangled and intertwined. Chinese investments in Africa, Robert Mugabe, Tedros Ghebreyesus. So Ghebreyesus becomes the WHO chief. When the virus from Wuhan started to go out, it was Ghebreyesus who stalled the information. It was Ghebreyesus who initially said that there was nothing wrong. It was Ghebreyesus who went to China and met Xi. He was the one who played it down, when he, as a microbiologist by training and a WHO chief, should have sounded an alarm to the world, which is where 2003 and 2020 are different. 17 years had passed, and China had become undergone this transition from a regular country, which is reliant on the systems of the world, to somebody who's an aspiring power who manipulates the systems of the world. And that's where we are. We can argue whether the Wuhan virus escaped from the Wuhan lab, and I call it the Wuhan virus because it's a virus from Wuhan. And the reason is that, you had the virus, Ebola virus. Where did it come from? You had the Spanish flu. Why do you call it Spanish flu? Why not just a flu? Why do you call it Ebola virus? Because it came from Ebola. So therefore, a virus that comes from someplace, I believe, should have its name, because there are precedents in the past, and there's no reason why they shouldn't. That being the case of China's civilizational aspiration that, look, I have to dominate the world at some point of time. After the virus outbreak, look at how China has responded. China has picked the battles. China has gone against Hong Kong as in terms of their sovereignty, in terms of Taiwan's independence, Hong Kong's independence and Taiwan's sovereignty, in terms of lashing out against Vietnam, putting its troops across 3 points at the LAC as far as India was concerned. It has also renamed. It has also claimed the Mount Everest as part of their own territory. It has picked battles with Australia and New Zealand on trade. With the US, we all know what's happening. So if you look at the response of China to the virus, it has been I wouldn't say it's a knee-jerk reaction. They had thought of it a little earlier, because if you see, when they started off these moves against the various against various countries, they had started off in January. It was in January when China had taken and I'll come to India now. China had taken the UN to the UN, the Kashmir issue. Now, what was the difference? China's always taken the Kashmir issue, always supported Pakistan, so there's no surprise there. But what is the surprise into January 2020? Because for the third time, and this is after, in the previous 3 months, it was the third time, and even more so in January 2020, it had taken the initiative to bring it to the UN, the Kashmir issue, laced with Aksai Chin and Ladakh. Why would they do that in January 2020? Aksai Chin and Ladakh, because that is what we are talking about right now, right? We're talking about the standoff around Ladakh. So they had taken it in January 2020 when there was a corona outbreak back at home. They believed, and they always, and I go back in the 60s, to the 60s, why is it like this? They always believe in taking the first steps. In taking the first steps, have you ever seen somebody else taking a first step and then China doing a standoff? No, it's China which does that. And then it climbs down or does whatever it has to. But China always takes a proactive step. And that's something that I must give credit to, however nefarious that might be. So they did that in January. And they started to lash out against Vietnam and the others in February as well, which was much earlier than when the corona outbreak had really, really floored the world. So China knew that there are countries that would stand against them in an alliance post-COVID. So what does it do? It doesn't stay back to say, oh, who's going to be against me post-COVID? It doesn't want to do that. It wants to take them head on much earlier. surprising them, shocking them, telling them that, look, you come around to our views, don't join them, or else we'll threaten you. The coercion, the bullying, the pushing and shoving of the Chinese is nothing new. That's where I go back to the 60s, especially with India. Because in the 60s, this is where it all started. In the 60s, and this is, if you look at 60s, 1962, China and India went to war. What happened? Why did? And there are several reasons, and we can go on talking about it. But one of the things that I see from a Chinese perspective is that whenever China has an internal issue, it resorts to external projection. And if you look at the current issue of COVID, and if you look at Ladakh, if you look at several other things around the world that China is trying to deal with differently, it is a function of the pressure that Xi Jinping and his government faces internally as well. That look, China has been under the hammer from everybody. How do we respond? What do we do? We go back and hate them and pick all disputes with each one of them. You pick Australia for trade, you pick India along the LAC, you pick the South China Sea for Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Even Taiwan, Hong Kong, they want to change the various existing relationships that they have had. And what do? Pick up old disputes. So this is something that defines Chinese behavior. And when there is an internal crisis, go project externally. Use nationalism as a force multiplier. That's something that China has done over the years, and that it surprises me that they continue to do so in a world which has changed so much in the last 50 years from 1960s. But the Chinese belief is that they can still do that. And the reason is because they can tell their people that, look, we are supposed to be at the center of the earth. We are supposed to be at the top of the game. And we haven't been given our place because people are jealous of us. And that's where nationalism works. That's where the Tianjia concept
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Sir, I just want to ask that if why don't the Indian army just scare off China for once and then it doesn't attack back?
Yeah. See, we are in a. So I'll come to this. If you look at China and India haven't exchanged hostilities in the last 53 years, right? And the last time they fought was in 1967, which I write in my book. In 1962, so to your question, Indian Army has never allowed the Chinese army to overpower it for the last 53 years. It has always been the Chinese media that talks about it, no one else. But if you see, the Chinese media this time has been very quiet. And why has it been quiet? Because in Doklam in 2017, when India and China had a standoff, and the Chinese media, if you remember 3 years back, Global Times used to talk a lot. Almost every day, Global Times used to talk about how China is going to give teach India a lesson. But what happened at the end of Doklam was there was a drawdown. The Chinese army climbed down from their high horses that they had put themselves on, and that was something that was a learning from Doklam. It was what happened. There was an image deficit that China faced after that, and that image deficit is that, oh, I made a lot of noise, but I ended up doing nothing. So to your question, the Indian Army has been at the LAC. We've had far better infrastructure than it had been in the past. In the last 7-8 years, the infrastructure has been really ramped up. I've been on to those areas in Ladakh or in Sikkim in recent times. The infrastructure is so good that it unnerves the Chinese. So why does China come back now to try and push India along the LAC? Is because China believes that once the infrastructure is complete, China would find it very difficult. And it is mostly complete. Indian Army has, India has, the Border Roads Organization has built a bridge there, and the DSDBO road, which connects this part of India over the Shok River with Daulat Beg Gulti and Dimchok. I think that is something that China is scared about. And it is also if you look at the Chinese ambassador's remarks 2 days back, it's a climb down from where they had started. He said, "Oh, India and China have more opportunities with each other than conflict." Why would a Chinese ambassador say that? He doesn't say that because he feels so one morning over a cup of tea. It is being told to him. And why it's being told to him? Because China believes that this cannot go any further. I believe I was asked a question a couple of days ago in an interview, and I said that this game of cat and mouse and pushing each other will go on. But there are protocols put in place in the 2000s between India and China is aware of that as much as India, that those protocols prevent both countries from going over the edge. India has to be also wary of how China, and this is where I think India needs to be wary of, how China will fight a different kind of a war right now. It's not going to be, everybody talks about whether China is going to come into India from LAC, from Ladakh. I don't think so. India is pretty much ramped up its infrastructure, but China always stays ahead in terms of creating new kinds of warfare, not in terms of India, but generally. And that's what would happen with China's support to the other countries. Yeah, go on. Somebody asked a question.
Sir, I think China is trying to put down India and other countries, just like leaking its virus so that the GDP goes down and then it hits the weak point.
Yes. I think that is a good point, Anhad, if I get your name right. China has greater ambitions. It's not the pushing through Ladakh, because if you think China pushes through Ladakh causes a conflict, the world is up at its throat, and at this time China can't afford a war. But China would want to manipulate this in other forms, whether it is economic, whether it's trade, and India's alliance. Let's remember India's alliance with other countries, because post-COVID, India has a very important role at the WHO. So what happens to China? Because India then allies with the US and the other countries. Today, I was reading about an alliance called D10 that has been put into place. Now, D10 is an alliance that wants to have keep Huawei outside and wants to have a separate alliance of telecommunication providers. So I had a brief look at it. It's got G7 countries and India, South Korea, and Australia. And also, so this is where the larger game, as you rightly said about the economic and trade part, I would include in this larger game the involvement of other smaller countries. Why do you see Nepal playing an important suddenly playing a role in a dispute between India and China? That was not there earlier. I think that is a difference now, that the employment or involvement of other countries which have and I said earlier, which have weak political systems, which have dictatorial leaders, and China can go in, play in that gap, manipulate it, and use that against India. And that's happened in Maldives earlier as well, which is what we are going to see more in times to come. When you go back to the 60s and look at what China, 1962, I hope some of you are able to read the book I wrote. 1967, and I come to the book and the watershed time of 1967. 1967 was a time when 5 years had passed. India had severe setbacks against China in 1962. At that point of time, Indian army fought a valiant set of battles, Nathula and Chola, where they defeated the Chinese army, gave them a bloody nose, and thereafter China has never ever even raked up an issue in terms of military hostility, barring one incident in 1975 when 4 Indian soldiers were killed on a patrol. Apart from that, there had been no incidents, no military hostilities. China has not won a single battle since 1962. It lost to India in 1967. It lost to Vietnam in 1979. So you think China is going to wage a war? I don't think so. It is now come to the 1967 battles. That had happened, and it's actually a shame that we don't remember the brave hearts. We don't remember those battles because they were the battles that established how history would flow, how the narrative would follow. It had actually changed the India-China narrative. The narrative that existed pre-1967 was one where people were fearful of China. And that was because in the 1962 war, we had poor political leadership. We had poor military leadership, which led to India's defeat. 5 years later, General Sagat Singh, a supreme battle commander, one of the best that the world would have ever seen, arguably, led Indian forces to two convincing victories over China, gave them a bloody nose, and that kind of shook China so badly that in 1969, because remember, China had done well in 1962, it had done well in the 1953 Korean War. So after 1962, it believed that it had the better of India. It could bully India. And that ended with 1967. Those battles that the Indian media, that the Indian political system, the military system, everybody forgot about or conveniently dropped it, which is what I find galling and shameful. Because that was something that India should be proud of. That changed the course of history. 1971, we all read about 1971. India defeated Pakistan and Bangladesh attained freedom. We all know about it. But how many have you or me or anybody in the world have read about why China did not interfere in 1971? It was just behind, just around in the neighborhood. They could have just cut India out at the Siliguri corridor, which is a narrow stretch of land, but they did not. They chose not to come in. The reason why they chose not to come in was 1967, because they had been given such a hammering. The psychological dent that they had suffered in 1967 made sure that 1971 was not a war that they would participate in. It also made sure, and so when you look at 1971, when you look at Bangladesh, when you look at India's victory, you have to credit 1967. And the soldiers, the officers, the General Sagat Singh, who made sure. And at that point of time, please remember, India was at a stage where it had lost to China 5 years ago. It was difficult to take a decision to really take on China, which General Sagat did. And not just did he take on China, he really turned the tables. The Chinese never, ever after that, had any kind of designs, military designs on it. It was in 1987, 2 decades later, that the Chinese again tried to push back India at a place called Sundarungchu. There was an Indian general called General Sundarji. So General Sundarji was asked by diplomats in Delhi, bureaucrats, to withdraw. So General Sundarji was told that the Prime Minister is not very happy with the fact that you're facing up to the Chinese and you don't want to withdraw. You know what General Sundarji told the bureaucrats in Delhi? He said, tell your Prime Minister to get better advice.
Sir, one more question. That
can I just complete this? You can.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So no, because I'm relating an incident, which you can ask a question after that. So the incident, and this is why I wanted to complete this, because I want to let you know what kind of leadership there is. There was a leadership of General Sundarji who chose to not bat an eyelid and tell a bureaucrat in Delhi that, look, tell your Prime Minister what that he should get better advice. And that's the kind of leadership one had. In 1967, when General Sagat, and I'll just complete this part and then Anand, you can ask me a question. 1967, when the battles were going on between India and China, and you can read in my book, and this is important for all of us to know in terms of a leadership lesson. General Sagat was faced with a dilemma. The Chinese were having an upper hand. And the only way he could defeat the Chinese was to use the artillery. However, the Chinese, the artillery could only be used with the consent of the Prime Minister's office. General Sagat knew that take the Prime Minister's consent from Sikkim at the border to Delhi, it would take more than 48 hours those days. So what did he do? because the Chinese were fighting, and they were taking advantage, and they would, Indian soldiers were being killed. He decided to take on the decision and launch the artillery on the Chinese. What happened was the Chinese were completely demolished. The artillery fire finished the battle. So here was an instance where a leader, when he's faced with whether should you, what is your priority? What is a higher calling? In this case, the protocol demanded that he spoke with the Prime Minister and took his her orders and then go on. That was the order of instructions. The other choice he had was to use it, because he was under pressure and he needed to use it. Why? Because what is his higher calling? When you have an order of instructions to follow, protocol to follow, that should be the way. But the other choice is to protect the country. The other calling is to, the other choice is a higher calling. The protection of a country, the integrity, the honor of a country supersedes everything. So that's what he did. He did not go by the protocol. He took his decision based on what was happening on ground to protect the integrity and honor of the country and to defend his country. So that's what he did. So when you're in a dilemma, that's something that a leader, and this is a leadership lesson that we all see from the Bhagavad Gita during the discussion between Krishna and Arjun. Similar kind of a dilemma faces all of us in our different walks of life. And I say this because this is a learning that we also take away from history. I had digressed towards the leadership lesson a bit because that I thought is important to convey given our interaction and students there in your university. I thought that would be a helpful example to narrate. Yes, Anhad, you have a question.
Sir, like Russia and United States are the one of the superior powers in the world, military powers, and they claim that they are good friends of India. Then why do the good friends don't see the illegal land which is taken down by China as China and be okay? Why this land belongs to India, and they don't even whenever they come to India, like Putin and our Trump, they don't ever talk about that matter. And like sorry to say, but our state government is staring like a lazy owl. And those guys, bullies like China and Pakistan, are just coming to take us down.
Yeah. So India, no, that's a fair question. It's an excellent question. India is in a neighborhood where India is surrounded by Pakistan and China, and that is something that India has always had to contend with. India is in a neighborhood like that. As far as the you raise the question of Aksai Chin and you raise the question of disputed lands or lands claimed by China wrongly. Now, let's also, I would think that your point is very valid. Outside leaders will only raise those points when we have done so. And I believe that for India to be a greater regional power, and I don't, or a global power someday, India needs to speak up a little more. And that's something that has happened in the past few years. And especially with respect to Pakistan, that happens very often, and India does speak up. But with respect to China, for instance, China speaks about India's issues, whether it is with Nepal, whether it is anywhere else. But similarly, India does not speak up as much with respect to China's issues in Taiwan or Hong Kong. Today or yesterday, Brahmachalani wrote a brilliant line that India should learn to speak up more if it wants to be a greater power. Because in international fora, and to your question, in international fora, nobody grants you things on a platter. These are engagements. These are tussles, pulls, and pushes where you negotiate. We do that in business. We have negotiations. We say, okay, this is what we give you, and this is what we are getting, and this is how it will come to a middle ground. So that is a similar issue in the political fora as well. For Aksai Chin to be brought up by international leaders at some stage, there are two things that need to have more proactive role by India. Number two, what also needs to happen is the change of the global context. Now, earlier, China was always playing an important role as far as trade, and still does, right? So there are a lot of economic linkages that prevent people from really stepping up and speaking. But with COVID, and COVID is something that is a game changer also. If it is used by the global alliance, if it is used by India, if it is used by the US in terms of putting pressure on China on several counts, whether it is economic, whether it is geographical or historical, such as the one that you brought out. It has to be a coherent push against China. And that can, and if you look at it, I go back to what I said. China knew that this push would come at some point of time. And that's why they have really stepped up, trying to push India at Ladakh. And that they did that before anybody else pushes them. If you notice, they have started to, they had come to Ladakh, across the LAC, and we have had a standoff for the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and also used Nepal and Lipulek, and the Lipulek issue is an old issue. It's not a new one. It's just that it's been rigged up because KP Oli, again, the Nepalese prime minister, faces internal issues. So China is putting money there or using its influence to get somebody else to speak for them. They realized the Pakistan model worked. So now they're using the Nepal route. They used to do that in the 60s when Sikkim was not a part of India. They used to, the Sikkim king was there, and they would send him gifts. They would, the king died and the prince became the king. China was the first one to send a congratulatory message. So they were meddling. So China's meddlesome behavior is something that's been on for a long time, and that's also part of the whole design of Aksai Chin. In fact, Aksai Chin, one of the things that China had proposed in the 60s was that you give us Aksai Chin and you take Arunachal Pradesh and we will resolve the border once and for all. India hadn't agreed to them because, Aksai Chin is part of our land and we hadn't agreed. It was something that is again left for debate as to whether we should have settled Aksai Chin with China and settle the border once and for all. But that's a subject for separate discussion. It's something that China believes, and there was another piece that I was kind of reading that China believes that India wants to take back Aksai Chin, and that's why it suddenly stepped up its aggression. It's also a fact that China is not very comfortable with India building roads and building infrastructure, which is of a very good nature at this point of time, at the DSDBO road that we're talking about. We're also, the Chinook helicopters, the Mi-17 helicopters, they have been deployed in the eastern sector as well. I mean, so that's something that China is quite scared of, the fact that India is upgrading its infrastructure, and soon enough it's going to take on China across the LAC, and that's something that China is not very comfortable doing.
We have more questions, so I'll request the participants if you can ask the questions. I think Mr. Rishabh, you want to ask some questions? You can ask the question.
Good morning, sir. Your talk is very, very informative. I was waiting for a talk like that when you was. My question is, Battle of Rizanga also played a lot on Chinese psyche.
Yes. And your question? Sorry.
My question is, China is interfering in the work that India is doing, building roads across the border. So will India be comfortably be building infrastructure and roads and railroads that China has done over the years?
Sorry, I think your voice, the audio broke a bit. Couldn't hear very clearly.
See, China has built infrastructure. China has built infrastructure across the border over the past 20, 30, 40 years. When India tries to do so, China comes over and stops the work and creates hue and cry. So will India be able to build roads? Because previous governments were very defensive. They were not willing to build up infrastructure across Himalaya, across Chinese border, So my question is,
yes, that's it. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
So my question is,
Will?
I'm going to say, will India be able to build infrastructure across the border? Like, will there be more skirmishes, scuffles if India builds infrastructure?
Yeah. So I'll answer your question in two parts. You spoke about Razangla. Um, that's a very important battle, often not remembered. And Razangla actually set the course. So 67 actually, gave the Chinese a bloody nose. But the Battle of Razangla is one of the fiercest battles, and that actually is another. And you brought it up. I'm so happy you brought it up because Razangla's battle was one that actually established that if the Indian soldier stands on the ground and fights the Chinese, the Chinese is no match, and that's something that they showed in Razangla. The defeat of 62 was a result of poor leadership and not because of the inability of the soldiers. The soldiers come from hardy villages and towns in India, and they've trained to the
Major
best
Shaitan Singh was there.
possible abilities. Sorry?
Major Shaitan Singh killed Chinese with his bare hands. He was a 6'5" in
Yes,
man.
yes. Yes. So Major Shaitan Singh, I wouldn't be able to comment on this height. He was a big, strong man, but the height is not important. The jigger, the brave, the courage within you is more important. And the reason why I say that is less number of Indian soldiers had they had taken on thousands of Chinese, and they had beaten back, I think, 5 or 6 attacks from the Chinese at Razagla. And we must remember that the equipment, the clothing, everything was very poor. And that's where the Chinese. So when you put 1962 in context, and we always feel that we had suffered setbacks, but it's important to set the context. This context is that people were fighting in these high altitudes in very difficult conditions and in hospitable terrain, wearing virtually nothing to really protect themselves. They had equipment which was from a World War II vintage. They did not even have the right kind of leadership or guidance. So there were several other things, but they fought valiantly. So let's address the other question that you had, and in terms of if China is interfering with our roads and should we build our roads? The point here is that over the last, as I said, 8-10 years, that infrastructure has been very good, and that is what is unnerving China. Whether China will try and interfere, it will try and interfere, and I don't see this as a one-off instance. That will happen once in a while, again and again. But India is also set on building the infrastructure. The army has also been. So what happens when you have a good infrastructure? The army is able to be brought in very quickly. Also, when you have good infrastructure, people are also able to stay longer in those heights because you have good infrastructure. Staying, the conditions are better, which is what India is trying to do, and which it will continue to do. And that's something. There's also the focus of the Northern Command has been China, so which is also something that will enable the logistics and the administration to be ramped up in years to come. I think that is something that will always unnerve China. China will, on its part, will always try to interfere, and this game will go on. You rightly said the governments have been defensive, which I totally agree. I think that has been the undoing over the last decade or so. I think that's improved, and in the 2000s somewhere, I think we did not really spend on the kind of infrastructure that we should have. In the 60s, definitely we did not have it, but now we do. And so therefore, any conflict with China, what tends to happen is in the hills, in the mountains, not much headway is made by, this is a classical, learning from military warfare, that, in the mountains, you won't make much headway. In the 1962 war, China had made headway because India was not, prepared and didn't have the logistics, didn't have the numbers to really take on China, didn't have the leadership. I can go on and on. But traditionally, you can't make headway in the mountains. So China will try and interfere with the works, but China can't. I mean, the possibility of a conflict over the Himalayas is very remote at this point of time.
One more question, sir. One more question. Sir, can Pandit Nehru be blamed for 1964? Because today's parties, all of them blame Nehru for everything.
Yeah. So I think we that's again a very debatable question that you bring up. See, as an independent, and I wear my independent hat all the time. I think it's important to put things in context, and the context is this: that let's understand 1962. We can blame the people. We can. I mean, certainly there is blame on when a prime minister loses a war. He's to be blamed. The buck stops there. The buck doesn't stop at bureaucrats level or some level. The buck stops with the prime minister, because you can blame Krishna Menon. You can blame General Thapar, who was the chief at that point of time. But the fact remains that the prime minister shares a certain blame for the decisions that he took, or the lack of decisions at that stage. However, I must say that having said that, there are other aspects as well. I mean, I wouldn't vilify the Prime Minister Nehru at that point of time, because India was also 15 years from the time it had gained independence. India was getting up on its feet, learning things. It had made mistakes, and it was one of those mistakes that it made in 1962. Whether India would have made the same mistake if the war had taken place 30 years after its independence, we don't know. But the fact is, India was still getting, ready. I believe if you look at the context, the World War had ended in 1945. So it had been 15 years. People were tired of a war, tired of conflicts. The Korean War had taken place in 1953. The Bandung Conference and other things had taken place, and Pandit Nehru believed that China was a friend at some point of time. So he didn't make his mistakes, but I wouldn't go so far as to believe that there was a complete vilification of the Prime Minister. I think he set in motion some of these things. We must remember in 1961, Goa was brought into India, and an interesting incident that took place. I might just digress, but just also shows that there's certain good things that took place as well. 1961, when India took Goa into their territory, General Sagat again was one who led the campaign into Panaji and captured Panaji. So Portugal wanted to send its ships. When Portugal wanted to send its ships, the Prime Minister Nehru, called up Tito. And Joseph Broz Tito was his friend, and I think he also called up Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was in Egypt, and made sure that the corridor of the sea corridor was not given for the Portuguese premier Salazar, because he wanted to send his ships and take on and protect Goa. So the delay of the ships, which was caused by the international relationship that we had with Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the Egyptian premier at that point of time, and I think Tito was also involved. These were part of same alliance, Prime Minister Nehru, Tito, Nasser. So that prevented Salazar from sending ships in time, and that also enabled India to capture Goa pretty easily. So 1961 happened. So the state of Goa became a part of India. I wouldn't say the state of Goa; it was a union territory earlier. So that became a part of India, and various other issues cropped up. There was also the issue of the Defense Minister Krishna Menon and his relationship with the previous army chief Thamaya. And Timaya was a super soldier. He had given a great account of himself in the Second World War. He was a Victoria Cross. But the bureaucrats, led by Krishna Menon, didn't have a great relationship with the army. Prime Minister believed, wrongly so, that the army was not really needed at that point of time, or was not needed with that strength. There were certain strategic mistakes that were made. It was he announced on radio that he had asked the soldiers to throw out the Chinese. So some of these things, the mistakes that were made were indeed made. I would go so far as to say that it's important to judge a prime minister in independent terms. He made mistakes. He set in motion some of the good things. But then both sides, I think I wouldn't vilify Nehru. I wouldn't go on to protect the prime minister where he had made mistakes. I think we should accept those. Yeah.
Pandit Nehru was the most romantic prime minister. WhatsApp University these days blames Nehru for everything. That Nehru offered the Security Council seat, which was offered to India. Nehru passed it on to China, and Nehru was in the idea of demilitarizing India. WhatsApp University these days blames Nehru for everything which happened in the past. They said Nehru said we are a peaceful nation, so we need to demilitarize. So Krishna Menon was in favor of demilitarizing India instead of keeping a large military. We are a poor nation. Nehru did not decide the border line with China. McMahon line was not decided. So China kept on going in. And Nehru was very complacent about losing excitation. Nehru said, "Wahan par to ghas ka tinka bhi nahi ugta." So WhatsApp University is feeding, I'm going to say, the generation today and blaming everything for Nehru. Nehru was a great statesman, a secular person. Nehru is responsible for India's democracy. What do you say on this?
So no, I would think so too. As I said in my previous response, that there are good things that happened, and I said 1947 India had gotten freedom, so it was only 15 years from there. There were mistakes that were made, and I would say that history has to be seen with an independent lens, and that independent lens tells us that India did make mistakes. Prime Minister Nehru did make mistakes in the 1962 war against China, and I also brought up the Goa accession where the Prime Minister did a great job and set into motion institutions that have stood the test of the day. So there are several things that the Prime Minister at that point did. He was a thinker. He was he was a visionary, and he did what he had to do, and he led the country at that stage, which was a very difficult stage of transition from British rule to independence. And due credit, it has to be given. And if we don't give credit to our past leaders, whether it was, and it is all, I mean, India has always had good prime ministers. I wouldn't get into the political side of it, but Atal Bihari Vajpayee, again, a formidable prime minister who re-established links with China in 2003, and the trade started after that. Again, wonderful, visionary in terms of what he saw. In 1965, Atal Bihari Vajpayee had led a flock of sheep against the Chinese to the Chinese embassy, protesting against them, saying that take the sheep and don't cause bloodshed. So, because China had accused India of stealing sheep and wanted to go to war because of that. So there were several things that had happened. Each era, and this is what I would like to finish with. Each era has a context. We cannot see 1962 with the lens of 2020. So 1962. We had lesser understanding of our, region around us. The communication was different. The relationship between the civil and military leaders was very different. And I say that we didn't have good civil-military relationship in 1962, which led to the defeat. There was nepotism of many sorts in terms of how promotions were made at that point of time. And what we had was a leadership that couldn't take on a war.
General, can I complete?
Can I just complete this?
Sure.
To that extent, the blame, and I say that whenever we are looking at dissecting history, we need to see, and it has to be a logical train of thought. We didn't take certain decisions in 1962. We made mistakes, and we should accept that. But at the same time, so therefore, there's no question of defending a mistake. We make a mistake, we accept it. And there were mistakes that were made. But at the same time, we cannot be undoing the good of the Prime Minister at that point of time. We should hold him responsible for the mistakes, and we should also hold him, give him the credit for establishing these institutions. 15 years after independence, India really had faced a biggest challenge, which was the 1962 war. India did make mistakes, but in 5 years thereafter, India corrected those mistakes. It's important to see what we did thereafter. In 1967, we gave China a bloody nose. In 1971, we gave we won the biggest war against Pakistan. In 1999, we won a Kargil conflict under Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So I would think that, cutting across political parties, we've had prime ministers who've been very formidable. In the last 7-8 years, this current government has done a good job in terms of beefing up the infrastructure against along the LAC as far as China is concerned. So I think we need to see decisions made in the context of that period, and we should hold people responsible for the mistakes that they make, but we should also give them credit for what good that they have done. And I think India really traveled a long way for the decisions that the Prime Minister took in the 50s and at that point of time. And we have to, the credit is due where it is due, and it established a country, an independent country at that point of time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Do we have time for one more question, please?
Can I ask one more question, Adi sir?
Sure, sir,
Please.
sure.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Ati, yeah.
Sir, what do you say about Three Gorge Dam China is building? People are saying China will pose threat to the water bodies of India building dam, Three Gorge Dam. So can you enlighten us about what is the dam phenomenon?
Well, I think I wouldn't have been somebody with a more with a deeper background about the water wars would be able to talk about it far more. But what I would think is that the Chinese ambitions is to and this is what I've always seen, even with the water wars. The Chinese ambition is to bring India to the table and get concessions and extract concessions out of India. And I think that is, and China knows that that's going to be another front where it has not been publicized as much. But that's something that you're right. It could be something that we could be talking about in a year from now, because that could be a front that China would open.
So we do have one more question from Yashasvi Singh Chauhan. The question is, sir, what will happen to trade with China after COVID-19?
I think that the answer is as much as the answer is the same that we all know at this point, which is we don't know. But the larger point is that look, there will be, I feel we cannot do away with China as far as trade is concerned. It's far too embedded. A lot of I as we speak, I was talking to, this is the business side of it. I was been talking to, when I talk to companies who have their who've either acquired a company in China or who have the supply chain base there. I think that is something, unless and until there is a substitute of any nature, that would continue. We can always talk about moving things to Vietnam and Japanese companies going back, which would happen. It would certainly have an impact on China. And that's why you see the response today in different political and military spheres. But going forward, and there is likely to be, and as I said, D10 alliance is coming up. There are several things that are coming up, but China cannot be wished away completely. I think the dependence, the world is still finding its feet after COVID. And to your question, what will happen? We don't know what will happen at this point, but I think it also depends on several factors. How aggressive the global, or how cohesive the global alliance is in pushing China to the table. What happens to the multi-billion, trillion-dollar suits that happen against China? Asking China to pay damages. So those, and let's not look at India from only an India-China lens, because India, as I said, even to your earlier question, India will is likely to play a larger role in an alliance. And if India plays a larger role in an alliance, India-China relations begin to be seen from that prism. Insofar as the regular trade is concerned, I think China will still be a factor here. But now, if the world decides to keep out Huawei, what happens to the various other things? What happens to Zoom? What happens to Tuk-Tuk or several other features that we use in our daily lives? I think those are questions that are more operational in nature. At the strategic level, I think there is likely to be a shift. India needs to be thinking more proactively and more aggressively in terms of what it would do, whether it, we cannot have Vietnam as a substitute for China. It's too small. We cannot, India, as far as India is concerned, to wish away China completely from its orbit. India needs to have we've skipped the manufacturing part. We went from agriculture to services. So do we have the wherewithal? Do we have the machinery? Do we have that kind of playground for the world to come in and have India as its base instead of China? I think we are a little far from it at this point, because India has not been a great implementer. So if India, if you cannot, do so by taking on China completely without having a plan B, is probably not the way forward. There will be pressure on China. I believe the global alliance will put its pressure on several counts on use of technology, especially, but and will have its back offices, say in Vietnam, in other places, in India, Philippines, etc. It will take away the dependence on China, is what I think. But China will continue to remain there. We also need to see what is how does that put pressure on Chinese internal economy and the political system, and what happens to Xi thereafter. It's an important phase, and you and I would be an important part of history that goes forward. As they say, it's called pre-COVID and post-COVID, and the post-COVID world will see a taking away of dependence on China, and India's interactions with the other, on account of trade with others, would increase in that sense. But but there will still be a Chinese connect, which will continue to be so. You can't wish away China completely. It is a large market. It's got its skin in the game, and it will continue to do so. How the world now, earlier China used to steer the world. China used to run it. Now that's going to change, and you're going to see a lot of tussle as far as trade and economics is concerned. I think Donald Trump has already made the noises. He's going into elections. It's important to see. So there are several factors. It's important to see who comes in, and if it's Donald Trump who comes in, well, I think China has a tough road ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Any more questions from the participant? We are open to the question answers round. Any more questions from the participants?
Yes, I do, if I'm allowed. I've asked so many questions.
Prabhakar, can we have one more question?
Yeah, one more. Can we do one more?
Kindly extend my thanks to sir.
Can't hear.
Sir, is there a possibility India can regain its territory from China, because it is difficult for Hindus to seek visa from Chinese to go to, I mean to say, over,
Can't hear. I couldn't hear the question.
Sir, is there a possibility India would someday, after 50, 40, 30 years, ever would regain its lost territory? We as Hindus, it is very painful for us.
Mansarovar? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear at all. But are you referring
Yes.
to Mansarovar? Okay. So
exactly. It is very painful. It is very painful for us, for Hindus, to seek visa from China to go to our pilgrim, which is Kailash Mansarovar. Is there will someday India be able to reclaim its territory?
The short answer to your question is no. I don't see that. I mean, I can always say, oh, well, we can do this and that. But I think if you look at it in realistic terms, where we are, where China is, where the world is, the world has seen increasingly less and less number of conflicts and, any other wars of any nature. So it would involve taking it by force. Leave aside the India-China force comparisons. The world has moved away from a conflict. So that is unlikely to happen. China is not going to have a negotiation to give that to India. So what? Therefore, I think, being a realist, I don't think that's going to happen. You will still need a Chinese visa. However, uh, if you look at Lipu Lake, and one of the reasons is Lipu Lake. The Lipu Lake road. Earlier, it used to be the longer you had to travel a longer time in the territory of China. Apparently, with the Lipu Lake road, that makes it a little easier to cross the pass. Otherwise, you had to go to Nepal and through other places. So the Lipu Lake pass, the Lipu Lake road that India has been building, that makes it viable to travel. I don't know the percentage, but I think it was 75% in India and 25% in China, or maybe 70 to 30. But it does change the equation in terms of the number of or in terms of the number of days spent in Chinese territory when you're going to monsoon trek, is what I understand, and that is where the Lipu Lake road is also being opposed. That it will lessen the dependence on Chinese logistics, and when you lessen a dependence on somebody, that person feels insecure. That look, now you're not going to be as dependent on me as you were earlier. But so that those things will happen. We don't know how technology will improve to ensure that you spend less time there in the future. Whether those two countries, I don't see that happening in the next 3 odd years. Whether there is a change in government in China and you have somebody that's friendlier to India in future, and you say that you have a similar kind of an engage, to your question, India cannot take back that territory, but if someday there is an agreement that how we Indians travel to Nepal, where we don't require our visas, is that similar? Is that something that would happen insofar as this trek is concerned at some point of time in the future? Is something that we could perhaps discuss. But insofar as India physically taking back that territory from China, I don't think that is going to be something that I visualize happening at any rate in future.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sir.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I think we are done with the questions. Yes, we are. So once again, thank you so much, sir, for sparing out your time and enlightening us with the history lesson about the India-China relations. We are extremely
Thank
honored.
you very much. Yeah. Sorry, please go on. My fault. Please go on.
We are extremely honored to have you, and I was looking forward to this session because I was getting many requests from few of the participants and few of the faculties also, because they were looking forward to gain insights on how India-China relations were framed and how it's going to be forward. So we are honored to have you over here, sir.
This was the most enlightening webinar I have ever attended on such amazing inputs. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rishabh. I really am overwhelmed by your thoughts and searching questions. And as I said, the questions are always interesting, and I love questions that challenge me as a student of history, as an author, and as a military historian, or as a soldier. I think that's something that happened here, and I'm very, very grateful for you to have given me the opportunity. And I'm very much, informed after the discussion by the questions that made me push the buttons to figure out what is it that should have happened, or what is it that we should look at history, especially your question on the handling of 1962 and how a prime minister should be seen, or some of these things can be political questions, but as independent analysts or as academia, I think it's important for us to have a neutral prism to look at actions and certainly not depend on what's at university.
So once again, thank you so much, sir. And I thank all the participants for taking the part in this session.
Thank you, Mr. Atipriya, and thank you, the participants. Thank you, Mr. Rishabh. It's been a wonderful session, and I've really enjoyed every minute of it. Please feel free to share your questions at any point of
Thank you,
time
sir.
later or anything. It would be a pleasure to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
और कैसे हो साहब? हेलो, वो सुनो, कोई ना